Good evening. We're really glad to have you here at the first return to CSOP, to the Canadian School of Peacebuilding lecture in 2022. As we begin, I would like to acknowledge the land where we are. So we acknowledge that we, settlers and Indigenous people, are in the territory of Treaty 1 in Manitoba, Canada. This land of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, and the Dakota people is also the homeland of the Métis Nation. In this place, we drink water from Treaty 3, Shoal Lake, and use hydroelectricity generated by the land of Treaty 5. As we reside on this land, we seek to be in right relationship with the land and original peoples, recognizing the harms of ongoing colonization and the societal and personal sin of white supremacy enacted through systems, policies, and interpersonal relationships. Here at Canadian Mennonite University, and particularly at the Canadian School of Peacebuilding, we walk with a desire to humbly learn from the Indigenous people of this land. We admit that our ancestors, churches, and government created systems, including the residential school system, that killed, maimed, and hurt Indigenous people. We admit that this legacy continues, and it is our responsibility to learn to walk differently. We come tonight to learn and relate respectfully with others. Thank you, and again, I want to welcome you all here to this community lecture with Dr. Johonna McCants-Turner. We're very excited to have her here this evening. My name is Jody Dewick-Reed. I'm the Academic Director of the Canadian School of Peacebuilding here at CMU. This lecture, offered for the first time in several years, is part of our second week of the school. Throughout the first 2 weeks of the Canadian School of Peacebuilding, we've had approximately 65 students, undergraduates and graduates, part-timers and full-timers, people from CMU, and people from other local organizations and universities. This year, for the first time, we offered a land-based course at Sandy Soto Spiritual Center, where we had 10 students on the land under the leadership of Adrian Jacobs, Keeper of the Circle, and also a sessional instructor here at Canadian Mennonite University, as well as Job Arnold. Another first for the Canadian School of Peacebuilding this week was a trip to Vogar, Manitoba, and the Lake Manitoba First Nation for a sweat lodge under the direction of a community knowledge keeper, Marilyn Hart, with students from the course All My Relations Seeking Justice in an Anti-Racist, Decolonial, and Trauma-Informed Lens. And for those of you on campus this week, you may have seen students from Dr. McCants-Turner's class sitting in circles outside where they've had lots of conversations. So we're really glad in the second week of the School of Peacebuilding to have this lecture. And I'm going to invite Sandy Coop-Harder, the Vice President External here at CMU, to offer another welcome and introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, Jody. Good evening. And welcome here on behalf of Canadian Mennonite University. I would like to welcome you all to our campus here, to this room, and to the online conversation. It's a beautiful evening in June, and you may be tempted to be outside enjoying this lovely weather. Also to acknowledge some of the challenges with the return to our public engagement and events is complex in a post-pandemic time, and so just to name that. As Jody said, my name is Sandy Coop-Harder, and I serve here at CMU as the Vice President External. It's my great pleasure and honor to introduce to you our speaker this evening, Johonna McCants-Turner. She is an Associate Professor of Peace and Conflict Studies at Conrad Grebel University College and University of Waterloo in Ontario. Dr. McCants-Turner has spent her career interrogating how violence and safety are categorized and interpreted in modern society. Her scholarship lies at the intersections of restorative and transformative justice, narrative peacebuilding, and contemporary social movements. Her work interrogates how narratives of violence and safety are shaped and reshaped into public discourse, public policy, and collective praxis. She also maintains a strong interest in the ways liberatory Christian theologies nourish resistance to violence and injustice in the global South and in North American diasporas. She formerly served as the public education teacher with the District of Columbia Public Schools, as the founder and director of the Visions to Peace Project, and as an adjunct professor at the University of Maryland, where she earned her PhD. She also holds a certificate in urban youth ministry from Fuller Theological Seminary and a graduate certificate in women's studies from the University of Maryland. Dr. McCants-Turner is a founding advisory board member from Life Comes From It, a U.S. grant-making fund that invests in Black, Indigenous, people of color-led movements for restorative justice, transformative justice, and Indigenous peacemaking. Please join me in welcoming Dr. McCants-Turner.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction. Good evening, everyone. I come here from Kitchener-Waterloo in Ontario, which is where I now live and work. It is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Attawandaron, and Haudenosaunee peoples. It is in the specific area where I live and work, it is also the Haldimand Tract, which is land that was promised to the Six Nations of the Grand River in 1784, but the Haudenosaunee people now occupy less than 10% of that place. And as a recent Black immigrant to Canada, whose ancestors were stolen and enslaved on stolen and colonized land that's now known as the US as well as Canada, where slavery also occurred, I want to acknowledge the interconnectedness of Black and Indigenous struggles for liberation. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be here. I'm grateful to God. I'm really grateful to Dr. Wendy Craker, who invited me. I'm so grateful to Dr. Jody Dueck-Reed, who has provided extensive support and coordination, not only for this lecture, but for me throughout the week as an instructor with the Canadian School of Peacebuilding. Thank you also, Dr. Kuparter, and to you all, the audience. I don't take it lightly that you came out this evening. The pandemic is still ongoing, and so it's especially just very moving to me that you came out to listen and to share, and in conversation, I hope. And I'm especially grateful also to the students whom I've gotten to know this week and learn from this week at the Canadian School of Peacebuilding. This morning, when we began class with the leadership of one student who is here, we recognized that today is Youth Day, the anniversary of the Soweto massacre, when hundreds of young people in South Africa were killed when they were participating and rising up against the apartheid state, and particularly in relation to educational system that was not only separate but very unequal. They were killed by police officers. For many of us, many people from many of our communities around the world, including my home city in Washington, D.C., and right here in Winnipeg, police officers are not a source of safety and protection. They are a vehicle of state violence. In tonight's lecture, I will amplify the work of women and femmes of color who, in recognizing state violence, envision and insist upon strategies and approaches for safety, protection, and accountability that do not rely upon the state. These strategies and approaches, I argue, are rooted in an understanding of what it means to choose love in the wake of wounding. Before I continue, let me further locate myself as a primarily US American scholar of cultural studies, a radical Black feminist, a survivor of intimate violence, a prison abolitionist, and a wannabe follower of Jesus. In this talk, I will place resources connected to these various dimensions of my identity and dialogue with one another, including anti-violence organizing, of which I've been a part, essay writing by Black feminist writers, many of whom are also survivors of violence, scholarship by Black feminist and womanist Christian theologians, and also the writing of Black feminist writer Bell Hooks, who's talked a lot about love, the ethic of love. And again, in tonight's lecture, I'm going to argue that liberatory anti-violence movements can contribute to a deepened and expanded understanding of what love offers as a Christian social ethic in the face of interpersonal and state violence. I draw from the lived experiences and moral wisdom of Black women, Black women's literature, especially fiction, and the contemporary transformative justice movement. What is this movement? Many of you have probably heard of restorative justice, this philosophy that centers healing, that centers repair, that centers accountability. Sure, rather than punishment. Transformative justice is similarly a movement for reparative justice that focuses on repair. But transformative justice has come from the work, the visioning, the organizing of women of color who have experienced the intersections of state and interpersonal violence. Many have been involved in movements against police brutality and movements against mass incarceration, as well as movements to challenge domestic and sexual violence. And out of an understanding, an experiential understanding of the violence of prisons and policing and the violence of in our homes, of intimate partner violence, for example, they have sought strategies that emphasize transformation, that emphasize an intersectional understanding of harm, and that emphasize a holistic approach to healing and safety. And I'm going to talk about some examples of what I mean by that as we continue. And in drawing from this movement, in doing so, I center womanist and Black feminist methods of doing Christian ethics from the margins, to quote liberative Christian ethicist Miguel de la Tour. Carrie Day, a scholar of constructive theology and African American religion, has written that Black feminist and womanist discourses turn to how social movements among women of color offer a prophetic politics of the ordinary that enflesh love our beloved communities. Building on this idea and probing this claim, I attend to the articulations, the well springs, the manifestations of love within liberatory anti-violence movement building, birthed by women, femmes of color, and gender non-conforming people that seek to challenge intimate and state forms of violence simultaneously, and particularly the violence of sexual and domestic violence within family and community relationships, and the violence of policing in prisons. And lest we think that these are only issues that impact communities of color, I want to name, for example, the work of a friend of mine. He works in a conservative Mennonite community in Pennsylvania. And his work involves, his work is based in restorative justice, but his work involves working with this community to ensure safety, protection, and accountability after sexual abuse has happened within many of these conservative Mennonite communities, many times by faith leaders in these communities. And so, given my focus, and that is an example which includes direct discussion of sexual violence, including the example I just named, I want to encourage you to attend to your own body, mind, and spirit throughout. And please feel free to take a break or leave if necessary. So with that, before I continue further, I also want to just invite us to take a few deep breaths. Maybe you don't want to breathe too deeply because COVID, but to take maybe some small breaths just to bring your mind with you into the space, to bring your experiences with you into the space. And I want to invite you, as you listen, to call upon the experiences that you have brought and the relationships that you have brought and the understandings that you bring as you listen from my perspectives and understandings and those that I center. For those of us in the room, and we are many people of many faiths and spiritualities in the room, for those of us in this room who identify as Jesus followers or want to be Jesus followers, as I sometimes call myself, as members of Christian communities, as well as those of us who do not, we might say that the center of our spirituality and faith is love. Yet there seems to be a gap between our doctrine and our ethics. Throughout her work, Black feminist writer Bell Hooks again and again calls out self-proclaimed people of faith, and particularly Christians, for failing to live love within the interactions of our families, the creation of new cultural norms, and the formulation of social policy. Imagine that, love shaping social policy. What an idea. In her book, All About Love, so she has these 3 books, trilogy on love. She has a lot of her books focused on love, but 3 books in a trilogy, and the first one is called All About Love. And in this book, she writes in reference to the United States. She says, while ours is a nation wherein the majority of citizens are followers of religious faiths that proclaim the transformative power of love, many people feel that they do not have a clue as to how to love. And practically everyone suffers a crisis of faith when it comes to realizing biblical theories about the art of loving in everyday life. Another passage that I think is worth quoting extensively appears in the second book in her trilogy, Salvation, Black People in Love, which is written to and for Black people, particularly people of African descent in the US. She says, religious teachings about love form the foundation of most Black people's understanding of love's meaning. Even though we have diverse religious experiences, a vast majority of us, Black people, she means, still choose to identify as Christians. The 2 great commandments, and then she said some more, and then she goes on, the 2 great commandments are that we love God, and what? We love one another, for those of us who are familiar. As serious churchgoers, I and my peers were instructed to read and study all the books of the Bible. To this day, I vividly recall the pleasure I felt reading what I had been taught was the love chapter. We actually read from this chapter in class earlier this week. From the book of Corinthians, I learned that to be loving meant to be kind, forgiving, full of compassion. I learned that love was more important than faith or hope. Yet the full vision of love evoked in the scriptures was not realized in most of our homes. And she doesn't limit this to talking about Black families. She goes on to quote someone else, a white writer, saying, writing about the link between Christian religious experience and love in his essay, The Mark of Churches, John Alexander reminds us that in theory, the church is not only a place of love, but a place where we learn to love. And here she quotes John Alexander saying, however, for Christians of all races, these lessons often stay at the level of theory and never become practice. When I was a child, I would often call attention to the failure of adults to live the beliefs they espoused in churches. In referencing Hooke's repeated plea for Christians to love not only in word, but also in truth and in deed, to reference a verse from the Bible, I believe that Hooke's emphasis on the ethic of love can serve as a bridge, in some ways a pedagogical bridge, or a theoretical bridge, or even a theoethical bridge between the nonviolent spiritual movement led by Jesus and liberatory anti-violence movements who insist upon challenging state violence and interpersonal and intercommunal violence simultaneously. Bell Hooks articulates love as an ethic that is antithetical, that is oppositional to all forms of domination, from white supremacy to patriarchy, heteropatriarchy, homophobia, right? All of these forms of domination and beyond, ableism. And it's relevant, she says, love is as relevant, perhaps even more relevant to social transformation as personal change. Drawing from social science literature, self-help books, Christian scriptures, and a wide range of other texts, Hooks, who herself, she's no longer alive, was a self-proclaimed Buddhist Christian. She drew from Buddhism and was really formed in the Christian tradition. At home, she prefers not only a theoretical, but a theoethical formulation of love. She talks about love as simultaneously spiritual and political. Oppositional to fear, for example, drawing on 1 John 4:18. A transforming force or a transformative power. She says love is teachable and learnable. It's not something that is instinctual, right? That we just know how to do. That love is practice and action. In that she references the work of German psychoanalyst Erich Fromm. She says love is a choice. It's something we choose, and it's will. In that she references the writer M. Scott Peck's definition of love. She says love is healing. It's healing and nurture. It's a creative art. It's antithetical to abuse. It's non-punitive, and it's non-negligent. So it's a love that refuses to punish, but it's also a love that refuses inaction. That is what love is. Liberatory anti-violence movements, I want to lift up today offer a pedagogy of the practice of this love ethic that I think all people need, but I especially want to emphasize people of faith. So in what follows, I'm going to provide an overview of three elements of this love ethic that I see embodied in liberatory anti-violence movements. And if we can imagine Bell Hooks' articulation of an ethic of love, and I have some of those key points on the slide, if we can imagine her articulation of an ethic of love as a musical composition, she returns to various sets of chords throughout. And I'm going to highlight some of those chords. I'm going to especially highlight the chords that I think are not only embodied in liberatory anti-violence movements, but are also grossly underemphasized in Christian religious teachings on love. The first chord is love as choice and creativity. Here I have this chord identified or named as neighbor love. Later on, I'll talk about another term for this neighbor love, agape love, but I'll talk about it a little differently next. And then I'll talk about love as a transforming power. Bell Hooks draws from psychologist M. Scott Peck in emphasizing love as a choice. To quote Bell Hooks, she says, "Love is as love does. Love is an act of will, namely both an intention and an action. Will also implies choice. We do not have to love, we choose to love." In I Hope We Choose Love, a trans girl's notes from the end of the world, Canadian writer, cultural worker, conflict transformation coach, Kai Chen Tom, urges social justice activists to, quote, "try understanding justice through an ethic of love," and to cultivate a love-based justice that, quote, "invests deeply and fervently in the dignity of human life, is grounded in the recognition that no one is disposable, and sets and enforces boundaries when violence occurs." One example of this emphasis in practice is the work of Creative Interventions, a liberatory anti-violence organizing project that emerged especially from the experiences of Mimi Kim, then an anti-violence advocate working in domestic violence resource centers located within U.S. Asian immigrant communities. Many of the women that she encountered who experienced domestic abuse, they could not or did not want to go to the police for a variety of reasons. Partnering with Rachel Herzing, an organizer and prison abolitionist, and a small team of other organizers, Kim connected community organizing to the work of anti-violence intervention. And one of the ways she did this is she invited women who were experiencing abuse to invite family members, friends, members of their faith communities, colleagues, anyone who could potentially support an intervention to the table. And then, led by a facilitator from this project, Creative Interventions, they devised strategies to intervene in what was happening, to provide safety, to provide support without any connection to the criminal legal system. For example, friends might take turns ensuring that a woman experiencing domestic abuse who does not want to leave her home is never left alone with an abusive partner. We talked about this example, actually, one of these examples in class today. And so what happened is this team, of people, they formed a team, and they began to say, come to our office and talk to us about what's happening. And we're not gonna solve your problems, but we are going to facilitate and equip you and equip your people who love you to actually do love by getting involved. Creative Interventions, after 2 years of facilitating those kinds of interventions, facilitating people to work together to figure out what can be done, they put together a manual. Can you imagine, or can you guess how many pages this manual consists of? After 2 years, they put together a manual of the tools and resources that they came up with. Can anyone guess how many pages of this manual was when they put it together after 2 years of just kind of putting together worksheets that they created to help people figure things out? Like, what's going on in this situation? Who could get involved? What can we do to ensure safety? Who can approach the person responsible for the abuse to kind of try to hold him accountable, to help him to take responsibility and to stop and to change? They put together a manual. Anyone could guess how many pages was this manual? 300 pages? All right, we got 300 pages. 300 pages? Multiply it by 2. It's over a 600-page manual of tools and resources that can be used by everyday people to intervene in interpersonal violence, right? Without relying on the state. And you can find this resource for yourself. It's at creativeinterventions.org. This approach to organizing everyday people, you, me, people who, many of us are professionals, people who are not professional peace builders, right? Or social workers, in the work of preventing, intervening, and responding to intimate violence and intracommunal violence, it reflects the practice of love as a choice to intervene and prevent harm from continuing to occur, which is also a practice that Jesus highlights in the story of the intervening Samaritan bystander, as told in the gospel stories of the Christian Bible. I tend not to use the term Good Samaritan, and even though that's the word that the term many of us use, and here's why I don't choose to use the word Good Samaritan, because Jesus is telling this story to people who have learned to define Samaritans as bad, right? As pathological. And so they're surprised at the actions of this person, not only by the inaction in the story of so let me tell the story for those of you who may appreciate a reminder, right? There's a man who's been beaten and left on the side of the road, and we have religious leaders who are expected to be the do-gooders who keep going. And the person who intervenes is, and really an everyday person, this person is not given a title, who's also has an ethnic identity of Samaritan, right? And so the reason I tend not to use the term Good Samaritan, because one question that I've heard that in sermons and just in kinds of reflection on the text is one question that may have come to the mind of the listeners, those listening to this story that Jesus tells us, can there be any Good Samaritan, right? So I don't want to enforce this idea that this person is an exception, right? And I want to emphasize that this person intervenes. And for those of us who read this story and believe in the ethic of love as its center, I think that Creative Interventions, this liberatory anti-violence organization, offers a guide to embodying this neighbor love in the form of practical action. I also want us to think about the kind of creativity that was required by the main character in Jesus' story, right? This character in the story of this intervening Samaritan turns a roadside inn into a refuge for healing. What kind of creativity is that? And liberatory anti-violence movements developed by women of color, femmes of color, gender nonconforming people of color also reflect this vibrant creativity. Like bell hooks, Black feminists, Christian ethicists, and theological scholars also affirm such love as a creative practice. According to religious studies scholar Karen Guth, the attendant ethic of creativity in womanist conceptions of love includes an emphasis on the dignity of human beings as creators and a construal of human agency as participation in God's creative activity. An understanding of this activity as involving a critique of the status quo, a critique of conformity, and an affirmation that such creative activity is redemptive. Liberatory anti-violence organizers offer a pedagogy of love as not only a choice we make to get involved when violence is occurring or has occurred, but it's also a creative intervention that relies on the resources we have at our disposal, which again, we can see highlighted in Jesus' story of the intervening Samaritan. Neighbor love, choosing creative intervention. This is a core that I want to emphasize and highlight from liberatory anti-violence movements. The second chord is agape love. Some people say neighbor love, agape love. Some people talk about agape love as unconditional love. But what I want to emphasize in the discussion of agape love, this term from the Greek that some people define as unconditional love or neighbor love, is truth-telling and accountability, which I believe is so grossly underemphasized, and I'm not the only one, in many of our communities, but especially in religious communities, and specifically for me, I speak from the Christian tradition. Per bell hooks, to conceptualize love as choice and action rather than a feeling emphasizes accountability and responsibility. Truth-telling and accountability are important dimensions of love emphasized in liberatory anti-violence movements. Yet, truth-telling and accountability are underemphasized as practices of agape love in both religious and secular contexts, if we want to affirm such a binary, which I would say, and probably many of us agree, is a false binary, religious versus secular. Speaking of the application of unconditional love in the face of violence and oppression, Melanie L. Harris, who's a scholar of Black feminist thought and womanist theology, she said, "There is a thorn in my flesh about how this fierce love and compassion is actually lived out when it comes to holding an abuser or oppressor accountable and loving them in a justice sense, disallowing them to harm themselves or harm others." Black feminist activist, writer, lecturer, and filmmaker, and restorative justice advocate Aisha Shahida Simmons profoundly challenges this pattern in her groundbreaking project, Love with Accountability. And so the first image you see on the screen here is a cover of her book called Love with Accountability. Aisha Shahida Simmons developed this project, Love with Accountability, and with, the word with is in all caps, W-I-T-H, Love with Accountability, as first an interactive online forum and then a book project. And she developed this project after her own experience of calling her parents to account for their failure to intervene in the childhood molestation she experienced beginning at the age of 10 from her pop-pop, her step-grandfather, the only paternal grandfather that she has known. Sexual abuse of children occurs in all of our communities. None of our communities are exempt. They occur in our families, right? They occur within the context of our faith networks. But it is something that we don't talk about very much, right? We rarely talk about. I'm gonna talk about it tonight, to break the silence. Challenging her parents to take accountability for their failure to believe her, to stop leaving her at her grandparents' home when they were traveling on international human rights trips, and to confront her grandfather when he was alive. She began ending her emails and texts to them with these challenges. She was in conversations, she also sent emails, she sent texts, and she began ending her emails and texts that she sent to them with the words, love with accountability. That's where it came from. It wasn't a theory, it came out of her practice, her challenge to her parents. She said, in doing so, I was emphasizing that my deep love for them would no longer shield their lack of accountability for the violence that I endured as a result of their inaction for 2 years and subsequent cover-up for 31 years. The purpose of the Love with Accountability project, according to Simmons, is to, quote, examine how accountability is a powerful and necessary form of love needed to address child sexual abuse. In the edited volume of essays, poetry, interviews, and stories, Simmons calls for loving attention to child sexual abuse within diasporic Black communities, a love with accountability. And I urge all communities to learn from this example and think about how you might apply it to your own. The foreword to the book, Love with Accountability, is written by Darnell Moore, a pro-Black feminist anti-violence activist and writer who also works to queer Black theology. He tells the story of a time he met his cousin at a bar to hang out one evening. Both he and his cousin are queer, and he's like, we're just gonna have a good time hanging out, you know, having the kinds of connections and conversations that we can have, and without the kind of limitations when other folks are around. And she's thinking they're just gonna hang out, have a good time at the bar, right? Do some bonding as cousins. And during that evening, she discloses that she was molested as a child by another family member. He writes about this story in the foreword to this book, Love with Accountability. He said, when I learned that my cousin's life had been forever altered by another family member whom I loved as much as I loved her. I'm going to say that again. He said, when I learned that my cousin's life had been forever altered by another family member whom I loved as much as I loved her, I needed something more to offer her. I didn't know what to do with the love I felt, which began to feel too expansive a sentiment in a moment when what was needed was a reckoning. I know I needed to love her in that moment and after, and I am reminded after reading this book, Love with Accountability, that if I loved the family member who harmed my cousin, then I have to be ready to be honest with him about the need for accountability. Preparing readers to engage with Simmons' edited volume, he writes, love with accountability is a reminder that reckon is in fact an act of love. Reckon is an act of love. Accountability is real love, it is radical love, and it is a just love that we need. Many people in this moment have been calling this contemporary increased attention to racial violence, to police violence, to racialized police violence. It's not just a problem in the US, right? In Canada, but also many, many places. They've been calling this moment as a reckoning. And so I want to invite you to, as you think about that, think about Darnell Moore's words that reckon is an act of love, that accountability is real love, it is radical love, and it is a just love that we need. Nearly all of the contributors to the edited volume, Love with Accountability, most of whom are survivors of child sexual abuse, as I also am, advance restorative and transformative justice responses as the practice of love with accountability that they desired when they were children. Other liberatory anti-violence projects led by survivors of child sexual abuse, such as those who founded the organization called Generation 5, have been developing models and frameworks calling for strategies that support immediate intervention once the sexual abuse of children is occurring, but also address the social and political conditions that make child sexual abuse more likely to happen, and refuse carceral approaches that sustain harm rather than interrupt them. The organization Generation 5 produced the handbook that you see on the screen, Ending Child Sexual Abuse. And this handbook is offers an amazing and nuanced analysis of the social, political, and economic conditions that serve as roots of child sexual abuse. They talk about the entanglement of sexual abuse with white supremacy, with heteropatriarchy, with adultism, the oppression of young people. For example, the lessons that we learn as we're children, that anyone can touch us, right? Oh, give your uncle and auntie a hug, go kiss them, don't worry, you know? Like, oh, I don't want to kiss them. No. You don't have control over your own body as a child, right? We're socialized into these kinds of lessons, the lack of power that children have. These are some of the roots that they address. This is also a resource you can find online. The organization Generation 5 was named for their vision to end child sexual abuse within 5 generations. And their work is entirely founded in a vision of working toward a world without prisons and police. They believe that the only way we can address and uproot child sexual abuse is to equip everyday people to do that work, to transform the conditions that keep people silent. For example, the fear that the person that is harming them, that they might also care about, would also be harmed. So interrupting these conditions, addressing their social and political roots, supporting immediate intervention is a part of what it means to choose love. Practices of truth-telling, accountability, and healing are also linked in Black feminist and womanist Christian theological and ethical framings of violence resistance. In addition to this body of theoethical reflection, followers of Jesus might reread a story of Jesus healing a hemorrhaging woman for fresh insights on this nexus of truth-telling, accountability, and healing. There's a story when Jesus heals a bleeding woman, and at the moment of her physical and psychological healing by Jesus, it is said in the Gospel of Mark that the woman told him all her truth. She engages in truth-telling. I recently heard a sermon by Reverend Mira Solani Joyner, a woman of color, a progressive faith leader, a pastor of spiritual formation, who imagined that this truth-telling that this woman engages in at the moment of her healing included the harm she experienced at the hands of others. For example, the ostracism and marginalization for members of her family and community, the exploitation by people who promised her healing only to take advantage of her vulnerability, right? Now, this kind of imagination we can see that we can imagine this is connected to kind of what one womanist theologian calls womanist midrash, right? Reading into, imagining what's behind the text. The gospel stories also, this is something that's not behind, but clearly for us all to see, the gospel stories, for those of us who are familiar with these stories about Jesus, also present Jesus calling out the hypocrisy and exploitation of religious leaders and challenging them to take responsibility for the harms they inflicted on others through their harmful religious teachings and oppressive practices. Likewise, liberatory anti-violence movements lift up practices of truth-telling and accountability as a loving and healing force with the potential to transform those who have experienced harm, right? And also those who are responsible for harming others, many whom are also survivors of violence themselves. Truth-telling and accountability are underemphasized practices of agape love, a Greek term used in the Christian tradition to connote love of neighbor and unconditional love. And this practice is also linked to a transforming love. Many of us say love transforms. It's a transformative power, but how much do we believe that? How much do we believe that in the wake of wounding? Beloved is a novel written by Toni Morrison, and it takes place in the US South in 1873. It centers on a Black family that survived the brutal institution of chattel slavery. In one passage, one character, Paul D., says of the main character, Setha, and her love for her daughter, Denver, he says, "For a used-to-be slave woman to love anything that much was dangerous, especially if it was her children she had settled on to love." He's talking about in the context of slavery, when at any moment your children could be taken away from you. The best thing he knew, it says in the novel, was to love just a little bit, everything, just a little bit. So when they broke its back, the child, or shoved it in a croaker sack, well, maybe you'd have a little love left over for the next one. In reading this passage, I want us to think about the conditions that enable a big love. What are the conditions that enable us to love big? And what are the conditions that have us loving small? In a later passage, Sethe herself talks about a more expansive love that she was able to have for her children. and this is after the end of chattel slavery. She says, "I was big, Paul D., and deep and wide, and when I stretched out my arms, all my children could get in between. I was that wide. Looked like I loved him more after I got here, after she got to the place where she now was and no longer enslaved. Or maybe I couldn't love him," this was in Ohio, "or maybe I couldn't love him proper in Kentucky because they wasn't mine to love. But when I got here, when I jumped down off that wagon, there wasn't nobody in the world I couldn't love if I wanted to." You know what I mean? This passage points to the external circumstances, the social, political, and economic conditions that enable us to love in bigger and more expansive ways, or that condition us to love in smaller ways. In the Gospel of Luke, specifically I'm referencing a story told in the 7th chapter, we hear Jesus naming these concepts: expansive love, a smaller love to a neighbor. Simon, who's appalled when his dinner with Jesus is interrupted by a woman who he can only see as sinful. She comes into the house where Jesus is reclining at the dinner table, and some of us know this story, maybe some of us may not. It says that she kneels and she anoints Jesus' feet with her hair. And Simon thinks to himself, well, if Jesus knew what kind of woman she is, he wouldn't allow her to touch him. And the text says that Jesus responds by telling a story. He tells a story. He says, 2 people owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii and the other 50. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he forgave the debts of both. Now, which of them will love him more? Jesus points to this idea of the conditions that enable a more expansive love. Simon replied, "I suppose the one who had the bigger debt forgiven." Jesus said, "You have judged correctly." And then he turned toward the woman and said to Simon, "Do you see this woman? I came into your house. You didn't give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, but this woman from the time I entered has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet. Therefore, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven as her great love has shown. But whoever has been forgiven little, or knows that they have been forgiven little, rather, I think in my interpretation, loves little. Whoever doesn't have this understanding, right? This passage points to the internal conditions. For example, the condition of experiencing radical belonging and acceptance, of being seen through the lens of love as enabling a more expansive love. Transformative justice, liberatory anti-violence movements more broadly reach toward this love even before the conditions shift. But these movements emphasize the transformative power of love in that they're not only emphasizing love to those who have been harmed, but also love for those who are responsible for harm, and a belief that people can change. They insist on an extravagant love. They also insist on an extravagant love that can shift the political, economic, and social conditions that make violence more likely to occur. And this idea of loving big and loving small in connection to liberatory anti-violence movements is one that I learned from a workshop that was developed by an organization called Insight, Women of Color Against Violence, that I myself used to be a part of in the one chapter in New York, developed this workshop on loving, they called it on loving big and loving small in connection with the popular education organization there. And they said, what kind of movements can we create that allow us, that help us, that invite us to love big, that make it irresistible? Movements that challenge all forms of violence was their response. One example of a belief in a transforming love that has the possibility of simultaneously transforming individuals and society is the Transforming Male Supremacy Project. And I have in the third image there, it's a quote from their website. It says, "Embodied. We can't just think or talk our way out of male privilege. It lives in our bodies and our behaviors, and we have to work there as well." The Transforming Male Supremacy Project It's based in New York City, and they started as a project that was developed to help men, particularly cisgender men born as boys, to account for and to learn to be not as more loving, but to be accountable to women with whom they are in relationship, to interrupt gender-based violence in their lives, and to recognize their own complicity with gender-based violence and its intersections with other forms of oppression. In their words, the push to work together as the Challenging Male Supremacy, it's called Challenging Male Supremacy Project, not Transforming. The push to work together as Challenging Male Supremacy Project came from a range of people and experiences in our lives. All of us at different times have been called upon by women, whether in our intimate relationships or political communities, like their activist organizations, to do more, not only to change our own sexist attitudes, to change our own sexist attitudes and behaviors, but also to work more actively on supporting liberatory practices and spaces within our communities, in part by engaging and supporting other men in being accountable for their oppressive behavior. Simply by growing up as boys and being men in societies such as the USA and the UK, which remain structured by the patriarchal exploitation and violence, our lives have been constantly marked by gender privileges. We have not only seen but also participated in the harm and injustice produced by institutionalized male supremacy. We have also experienced in different ways the violence of men, whether at home, at school, or on the street. For example, the ways that men are punished for failing to express, right, dominant ideas of masculinity. Going back to what they say, at the time when we first met together to discuss forming the Challenging Male Supremacy Project, one of us had begun to speak publicly about his own experiences of being sexually abused by a young man when he was a boy. We recognized in our own lives some of the costs of male supremacy to men, as described by Bell Hooks, who writes of men that the terrible price they pay to maintain power over us is the loss of their capacity to give and receive love. She observes that, quote, all visionary male thinkers challenging male domination insist that men can return to love only by repudiating the will to dominate. Some of us were being asked to participate in processes to hold accountable men in our activist communities who had abused or assaulted women. We saw the violence being done to women and gender nonconforming people by men within social justice movements, and how this violence was weakening movement struggles for greater justice in the world. We recognize that left unaddressed, male violence within our communities reinforces the status quo of existing oppressive systems and undermines the belief that a better world is within our collective grasp. All of that comes from the writing by the leaders of the Challenging Male Supremacy Collective. In Dr. Bell Hooks' essay, Love as the Practice of Freedom, and throughout the works of her Love trilogy and beyond, she issued a prophetic call for progressive social movements to root themselves in the ethic of love. In the last chapter of her book, Salvation, Black People in Love, she put it this way: we need a progressive, transformative vision of social justice that would combine the wisdom of a successful, nonviolent, love-based freedom struggle with the insights of a direct action, decolonizing movement for Black self-determination and liberation. I believe that at this moment, the movements that she longed for have dawned. I believe that the movements that I have talked about, the transformative justice movement, streams of restorative justice work that have been led particularly by women of color, as well as the Black Lives Matter movement, the global Black Lives Matter movement, is an example of this progressive, transformative vision that centers love and nonviolence, direct action, decolonization, self-determination, and liberation. While in both Love and the Practice of Freedom, Love as the Practice of Freedom, an essay that appears in her book Outlaw Culture, and her book Salvation, Black People in Love, Hooks is specifically concerned about the changing contours and principles in the center of the Black freedom struggle. She also expressed her vision of love-centered liberatory movement more broadly in other work, such as in the book I talked about earlier, All About Love. I have amplified the writings and practices of contemporary women of color, activists, organizers, and practitioners of reparative justice, which I use as an umbrella term, who emphasize that there is a prominent and undeniable role for love in the wake of wounding. In order to argue that the love ethic is a moral compass of liberatory anti-violence movements, in advancing reparative, healing, accountable, transformative responses to violence, and also condemning carceral remedies, they insist that love, not punishment, not domination, not neglect, not inaction, not complicity with the status quo or state institutions, must guide how their racial, ethnic, and political communities address interpersonal, intercommunal, and intimate harms. And in doing so, I model a dialogical engagement that is necessary for the flourishing and growth of multi-sectoral social movements seeking an end to violence and domination in all its forms. As Hooks has written, choosing love, we choose to live in community, and that means that we do not have to change by ourselves. We can count on critical affirmation and dialogue with comrades walking a similar path. And so with that, I invite us to learn from these movements, to see these movements' leaders as comrades walking a similar path that can offer a pedagogy of the practice of love. Thank you.
Thank you, Johonna. We're so glad to have you here to receive the challenge, to receive the words about love. And I want to invite you all as a community now, what are your reflections? What are your thoughts? Do you feel motivated towards a certain kind of change, a certain kind of love that you would like to take on? Love with accountability, love with truth-telling, love that is transformative, love in action. What are your reflections? Spend a moment in silent reflection, and after you have something you want to share, we'll invite you to either go to the microphone in the back or to speak it loudly, and I can repeat it so that people who are online can also hear. So let's take 30 seconds just to reflect. So I want to invite you now to speak out loud. If there's something that you're feeling more compelled to do, some kind of love you want to put into action, or any kind of reflection on Johonna's lecture this evening. John.
Can we come up here? Thank you so much. There's so much to think about and do, both. Really, a couple of things that struck me were just how you said we have to choose love, right? That it's not instinctive. It's a choice, and also wounding. The way you added the ing to wound, that's sticking with me. This present, continuous way in which violence operates in the world. That's one thing that's sticking with me. The other thing that's sticking with me is actually the connection between the Samaritan and people who are at the forefront of justice movements today. That actually it comes from places that occupy this neither nor kind of position that does not fit these binaries that we sometimes use to, like Samaritan, who is this person? Is he Jewish or Gentile or somewhere in between, right? And just as many people at the forefront of social justice movement they don't fit this binary that is created by a heteronormative framework. So I'm thinking about how recognizing violence is a challenge on the one hand, but it also seems to me that recognizing love can be a challenge in the sense that recognizing that the Samaritan was in fact good seems to be a stretch of an imagination sometimes, just as our imaginations are stretched to recognize love at work even in our midst today, that it's neither nor, just that kind of liminal framework. I want to ask you a question. Here's my question. Citing kind of bell hooks, you defined love as non-punitive and non-negligent. I'm intrigued by that. We are so used to thinking of non-negligent love as being punitive. Could you expand a little bit on that? Thanks.
Yes. Thank you so much for those reflections, Dr. John Bupalan. And, or Bupalan. Bupalan. Thank you. Thank you for those reflections and for that question. Yes, I was, in this idea comes from, particularly as I was talking about it, I was referencing the work of bell hooks. And she, particularly I was thinking about an example that she gives of children. And she talks about the discipline of children. She talks about how some children grow up in homes where they experience corporal punishment, and that many adults don't think that this is a problem, right? And she talks about the lessons that children learn, right, from that about violence. And then she also talks about, and so she critiques this kind of punitive approach. But she also talks about children who grow up and they're just allowed to do whatever they want as well. She also critiques that. And I drew a connection between contemporary practices of either choosing punishment, for example, let's call the police, let's throw this person in prison, or let's not do anything at all, right? For example, we're more likely to choose the negligence when the harm has been done by someone that we are close to, someone, for example, in our church community, right? For example, examples of sexual harm. Let's bury it. Let's not do anything about it because we don't want the punitive approach to come. And so I think it offers us a challenge of what does it mean to be non-negligent, but also non-punitive.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to stand up, share a reflection, voice a question?
Just a reflection, sort of building on what you just said. What I had been thinking was, you were talking about social justice practitioners who have abused others within the movement, kind of that reckoning. And I was really thinking, in addition to that, which you've just alluded to, is how we need to do a much, much better job in the church of holding our leaders accountable, whether it's church leaders or community leaders. I attended a church where initially 3 women came forward and eventually more than, I don't even remember how many women came forward. And the pastor initially denied it and essentially called them liars. And still to this day hasn't taken responsibility. It makes me angry because I feel in our churches, our leaders could show much better examples. You think about the movie producer, who's, of course, he's gonna deny it. He's a jerk. But, our spiritual leaders to actually be accountable, to be held accountable, to love and to be willing to repair. And I do not see that happening in most cases. And many cases I'm aware of in the church, in the Mennonite church and outside of the church, these investigations are botched. You know, it's a sad thing. So it just made me think about how we need to move towards this more in our own church communities, Mennonite and beyond.
I really appreciate those reflections, Shadell, and it makes me think about how, again, to go back to the last slide I put up around referencing Bill was talking about dialogue with comrades, right? And so there are practices about how to support accountability emerging from these movements. So what if, for example, Mennonite church communities, the ones that you're talking about, studied these examples?
Dan Aptison. I'm semi-retired from teaching Bible here at CMU. And I'm going to sort of explore a little bit this distinction between being non-negligent but being non-punitive. And I'm wondering if that's always possible. I was involved here some time ago. We had a male student who had done some pretty horrible things to a number of female students. And we had to be non-negligent and deal with him and confront him. And it was pretty clear we had to say, you are no longer welcome physically on this campus because you pose a threat to our female students. Now, for me, I mean, it felt like being non-negligent, but for him, it felt we were being punitive. So whether that distinction between being non-negligent yet non-punitive, that's not always an easy distinction. Anyway, just if you have any thoughts on that.
Thank you. Thank you so much for those reflections and that question. I'm thinking about my friend and colleague I count as a mentor, Dr. Howard Zare, a scholar of restorative justice, and he defines punishment as, and I don't know if in doing this he was referencing someone else, but from him I learned to define punishment as pain intended as pain. Punishment is pain intended as pain. And so, for example, it might feel bad, it might be difficult, it might even be painful for me to say, to actually accept responsibility for harming someone else. It might be painful for me to leave a community so that someone else feels safe. But punishment, with this definition, is pain intended as pain. That the goal is to make someone hurt because they've hurt someone else.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Thanks for your question.
I think we're all going home with a lot to think about, a lot to reflect on, to consider the role of love in our life, the role of love with our neighbors, the role of love as we make our way in the world. So I want to thank Johonna very much for being here tonight and for encouraging us, for strengthening us, for allowing us to think how we can be peace builders through acts of love in our everyday community. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for coming.
And thanks to everyone for showing up tonight. The fact that we had, even the 23 of us, super glad that we are here tonight. So thanks again.
And thanks to you joining online. Hi, Kimmy.